Everybody is talking about tariffs from the White House all the way down to your local cafe in small town USA. The American people have been infatuated the last couple weeks, couple months, even since 2016 and beyond with this concept of tariffs. It's been popularized because of Donald Trump and his economic policy. A lot of people are debating free trade, protectionism. Where's the tariff play into that? And during these discussions, I hear a lot of opinions, but I don't hear a lot of facts. So, on today's episode of American Made, we're going to be talking about the facts, the history behind the tariff. And I really don't know if there's anyone more qualified to talk about this than our guest today. But before we get to him, I just want to give a little bit of backdrop. So, everyone knows that President Trump has instituted these reciprocal tariffs, he calls them kind reciprocal tariffs, because often the ones he's imposed are not matching the tariffs that other countries are imposing on the U.S. They're maybe 50% of the tariff that's being imposed upon the U.S. by the EU or China or a whole bunch of different countries. And the president has started to hit the tip of the iceberg on telling the public the history behind the tariffs. Just in the Oval Office a few days ago, he said that our country was the strongest it's ever been between 1870 and 1913. He even blamed the Great Depression on the removal of tariffs. Here is the president talking about that.
It was the strongest, believe it or not, from 1870 to 1913. You know why? It was all tariff-based. We had no income tax. Then in 1913, some genius came up with the idea of let's charge the people of our country, not foreign countries that are ripping off our country. And the country was never that kind of wealth. We had so much wealth, we didn't know what to do with our money. We had meetings, we had committees, and these committees worked tirelessly to study one subject. We have so much money. What are we going to do with it? Who are we going to give it to? And I hope we're going to be in that position again.
So there's the president talking about that, scratching the iceberg, tip of the iceberg on the history. But I've gone back and forth on this issue. You know, typically my inclination is to be fully free trade, but I also understand the reality of our country being ripped off. But there's an even deeper issue to that, and that is the implementation of income tax into this equation. And to understand that, we have to go back and look at the history of income tax and that of tariffs, of which there is a very plentiful history in our country, which no one's talking about. And one in, I'd say, a million Americans probably could articulate to you. So today, I think we have probably the best historian alive in the United States of America. And I'm not saying that just to compliment him. I really do believe that. I've met a handful of historians, and that is William Federer. He is the president of Amerisearch Incorporated. He's published tons of books. I've got a couple of them I just pulled off of my bookshelf, ones that I've read. This one I read cover to cover, What Every American Needs to Know About the Quran. Terrific. The Faith of FDR, another great book of his. And then a kind of encyclopedia. I was just using this the other day for research purposes. America's God and Country, Founding Fathers, Quotes, Exceptional Works. He has a whole bunch of other books, including Silence Equals Consent, which I believe is his last book, his most recent one. The Interesting History of Income Tax, which we're going to talk about today. 3 Secular Reasons Why America Should Be Under God. Socialism, The Real History from Plato to the Present. Tons and tons of great books. That's just hitting the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg there. Mr. Federer, thank you so much for joining us here on American Made today. Tell us a little bit about the history behind tariffs.
Right. Well, as you mentioned, I have a book. It's called The Interesting History of Income Tax. And there was no income tax in America prior to Lincoln. The number one way the federal government was financed was with tariff taxes. And so we have to get a little background. Industrial Revolution. Ireland burned peat moss, this mud that they would dig up and dry it out and burn it in their fireplaces. But in England, they burned coal that they would mine out of the ground, and the coal mines would fill up with water. So in 1769, Isaac Watt invented a steam pump to pump water out of coal mines. It quickly turned into a steam engine and ran factories. And so instead of making thread by hand with looms and spinning wheels, they could have factories make them. if you put wool under a microscope, it has little barbs, and the tighter you pull them, the stronger the thread gets. And this would all have to be done by hand. But now you have these factories. And so they would make textiles, which is bolts of cloth and wool and materials, very inexpensively. But they did not allow the British colonies to have manufacturing because the factories in England wanted a market. And so when America broke from Britain, the first thing our country did was put tariffs on goods imported from other countries to make them more expensive so that we could have the Industrial Revolution here at home. And so tariff taxes is mentioned in the Constitution as the way the federal government would get its money. It's Article 1, Section 8. It says that the federal government shall lay duties and imposts. Those are terms referring to tariffs to help pay the debts, provide for the common defense, and the general welfare of the United States. And so George Washington's second bill that he signed into law was the Tariff Act of 1789. It imposed a 5% tariff on all goods being imported into the United States. And so who was in charge of the federal government's revenue? Well, the Secretary of the Treasury, whose name is Alexander Hamilton. And so he invented the Coast Guard. What was it for? To stop countries from smuggling goods into America and not paying the tariffs. Right. So instead of going to the big ports, they would try to smuggle it in some other way. And so the fastest ship of the day were called cutters. They were sailboats. And so these were called revenue cutters. And they would catch these ships to collect revenue for the federal government. And so this is the way that the federal government got its money. Thomas Jefferson, the third president, stated April 6th, 1816. It may be the duty of all to submit to this sacrifice to pay for a time an impost on importation of certain articles in order to encourage their manufacture at home. So, okay, we're going to have to buckle down. It's going to be a little bit more if you're going to buy stuff from Europe, but because it's more expensive, there's an incentive for us to begin manufacturing here at home. So factories sprang up across America, particularly in the northern states. And so they had steam engines powering spinning jennies to make the thread, and enormous looms where they would be able to take this thread and sew it into bolts of cloth. They would make shoes and chemicals and clocks and farm machinery, especially mechanical reapers. So instead of having to pay manual labor to walk through a field, you could have these big machines doing it, right? Originally pulled by horses and then pulled by these steam engines. And food prices began to go down. And then we saw the fastest rise in the standard of living in human history. And it particularly freed up women. So women were the ones who spin the thread. They would have those spinning wheels and they would sit there for hours, and then they would take that thread and sew it into cloth, and then they would sew the cloth. But now with the Industrial Revolution in America, they could buy a bolt of cloth, or get this, even ready to wear clothes. Wow. And then instead of washing the clothes in a wash tub and hanging them out on clotheslines, you could have a washing machine and eventually a drying machine. And then instead of drawing water from a well and carrying it in buckets to the house, you could have water piped right into the house. So instead of outhouses, you could have indoor plumbing. Wow. And so with this rise in the standard of living and with this industrial revolution, it produced jobs for the waves of immigrants that were coming into America. Right. So somebody could come over and they didn't know the language, but they could work in a factory, and then they would send their kids to school. And then every new wave of immigrants, we didn't have unions, and it was cheap labor. And so everybody's being pushed up the ladder. From 1792 to 1812, the tariffs were around 12.5%. After the War of 1812, tariffs went up to 25%. 1820, tariffs were at 40%. And by 1860, they were nearly 60%. Franklin Pierce, the 14th president, said on December 5th, 1853, "Happily, I have no occasion to suggest any radical changes in the financial policy of the government. Ours is almost, if not absolutely, the solitary power of Christendom, having a surplus of revenue drawn immediately from imposts on tariffs, imposts on commerce. So here we are, we're taxing these goods being brought into America." Ben Siegelman wrote for the Commentary magazine in March of 1962. The article is titled "Tariffs, the Kennedy Administration, and American Politics." Siegelman writes, "In the early years of the Republic, all but about $20,000 of the $4.5 million of Treasury income stemmed from tariff levies. Up to the Civil War, in fact, over 90% of the federal government's receipts came from tariffs. Now we have the Civil War. What's this all about? Well, you had the South. They did not have factories. And so they were in a position of either having to buy more expensive stuff from Europe because of these tariffs, or more expensive stuff from the northern factories since they didn't have factories. And so several times prior to the Civil War, when the South would have a crop failure and they were paying these tariffs, they would threaten to not collect the tariffs. Henry Clay and several others, and John Calhoun. And so when the 1860s came along and the southern states, particularly Charleston, South Carolina, when they threatened to stop collecting the tariffs, that's when Lincoln sent the federal troops down there to the Fort Sumter to make sure they were collecting the tariffs, and the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter and started the Civil War. Now, once the Civil War was started, the North, about 90% of the tariff income was collected at southern ports. So once the South had rebelled and broken away, there's no federal revenue. And so the federal government is like in a tough place. And so Lincoln institutes the first income tax in America. It was an emergency income tax to raise $750 million to finance the Union during the Civil War. Once the war was over, the South was now part of the country again, and the tariffs were being collected. There's no emergency, and the income tax is repealed. And so tariffs went on to be the number one way the federal government was financed all the way up through the early 1900s. Matter of fact, in the year 1900, tariffs were at a high of 95%. Even George Washington Carver, we're familiar with him, the Peanuts, Tuskegee Institute. So he helps popularize the planting of peanuts in the South. But they had a problem. Peanuts were being imported from China cheaper than what the farmers in the South could grow them at. So we have cheap stuff from China. Sound familiar? So the United Peanut Growers Association, January 21st, 1921, sent George Washington Carver to Washington, D.C. to lobby the House Ways and Means Committee to put a tariff on peanuts imported from China. And they did. It's called the Fordney-Macomber Tariff Bill of 1922, and then followed by the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Bill of 1930. And so
we've been putting tariffs on China for over 100 years. Is that what you're saying? This is nothing new. This isn't Donald Trump pulling this out of his hat, right?
Yeah. And everybody understood this is a way that if for them to have the opportunity to do business in America, this is the price they have to pay to get access to our market. And so, but it also provided a benefit for businesses located on American soil. Now, the move against tariffs began with the income tax. And so Lincoln had a temporary income tax and it was repealed. But then you had a bunch of German immigrants coming over infected with Marxism. And they would work in the factories and they would organize and they would begin to say, hey, let's take from the rich and give to the poor. Every man according to his ability, to every man according to his need. And in Europe, you had an entrenched elite that had been there for centuries, and there was no upward mobility chances. In America, anybody that was rich got rich just within their own lifetime. But nevertheless, these German immigrants began to organize and began to want to push through a redistribution income tax. So they passed one in 1892, but then it went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, in the case of Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust, declared income tax unconstitutional. It's 1894. The Chief Justice is Melville Fuller. He says the original expectation was that the power of direct taxation by the federal government would be exercised only in extraordinary exigencies like a civil war. And then Justice Stephen Field said, the income tax law under consideration is class legislation. Whenever a distinction is made in the burden a law imposes or the benefit it confers on any citizen by reason of birth, wealth, or religion, it's class legislation. It leads to abuses. The income tax is essentially in the character of the English income statute of 1691, which taxed Protestants at one rate, Catholics at double the rate, and Jews at triple the rate.
Oh, man.
It was basically DEI for finances, right? We're going to tax you more. I just saw just this morning where somebody had to get an ambulance in California. And when they found out that this person had insurance, they raised it from $600 to $2,000. And it's like, wait a second, you can't discriminate. So this is like DEI for finances. And the Supreme Court declared income tax unconstitutional. So what's the answer? Amend the Constitution. And that's what Woodrow Wilson did. And so he pushes through a 1% tax on the top 1% richest people in America. It was actually tacked on to a tariff bill in 1913. And whether or not it was properly ratified is up for debate. But the fact of the matter is, it was just going to tax the Rockefellers, Carnegies, J. Paul Gettys, Astors, Flaglers, Harrimans, Mellons. It wasn't going to tax the common people. Today, it would be just taxing Bezos, Zuckerberg, Soros, Larry Fink with BlackRock. It's not going to tax us, the people. So then World War I started, and everyone said, well, we had an income tax during the Civil War, and it was an emergency. And now it's World War I, which is an emergency. So, okay, we're not going to make an issue for the income tax. But then World War II starts, and you have Franklin Roosevelt. And he has the largest tax increase in history, and he extends it to everybody in the country. And the problem was most people made about $5,000 a year, and they were not used to saving up money. But this income tax was part of the Uncle Sam Needs You posters, buy war bonds, and smash the Axis, pay your taxes. And so John F. Kennedy, April 20th, 1961, said, in meeting the demands of war finance, the individual income tax moved from a selective tax imposed on the wealthy to the means by which the great majority of our citizens participate in paying. So here's Kennedy, 1961, saying that originally it was a selective tax imposed on the wealthy, but now everybody pays. But since people hadn't gotten into the habit of saving up money and having a chunk to turn over to the government at the end of the year, Beardsley Rummel, the chairman of Macy's department store, the Thanksgiving Day parade, he becomes director of the New York Federal Reserve, and he gives FDR an idea called paycheck withholding. And so Kennedy says, April 20th, 1961, withholding on wages and salaries was introduced during the war when the income tax was extended to millions of new taxpayers. So whenever you see withholding from your paycheck, that was an emergency effort introduced during World War II. The war ended, but it didn't.
Right.
But there is a side effect of FDR raising the taxes. It's called outsourcing. You squeeze the sponge, the water goes out. You make it more expensive to have your businesses located in America. Well, business people aren't successful because they're dumb. They're smart because they make good financial decisions. And if they have cheaper labor overseas. So after World War II, we are rebuilding Germany and Japan with brand new equipment. And so the business owners are like, look, we're rebuilding stuff over there already. Let's just build stuff over there and then take our profits and lobby politicians to lower the tariffs so we can bring stuff back into America cheaper. And this is called free trade. So John F. Kennedy said, February 6, 1961, I've asked the Secretary of the Treasury to report on whether the present tax laws may be stimulating an undue amount of flow of American capital to industrial countries abroad. Kennedy goes on, April 20th, 1961. In those countries where income taxes are lower than in the United States, the ability to defer payment of U.S. tax by retaining income in subsidiary companies provides a tax advantage to companies operating through overseas subsidiaries, which is not available to companies operating solely in the United States. So he's saying, look, we're losing all this capital to all these other countries because they can produce stuff cheaper. Why? They don't have unions. They don't have government regulations and red tape. They don't have an EPA. They don't have to worry about lawsuits, and they don't have to worry about taxes. And then we find out that many of these countries will give subsidies to these companies intentionally to have them produce stuff cheaper, and they import it into America with low tariffs and then sell it cheaper and then undercut American businesses and put them out of business. And once they're out of business, the foreign countries can then flex their muscles and say, if you don't cave on foreign policy issues, we're going to withhold the products. And then all the people in America will start screaming at their politicians, oh, lower the taxes. I want my cheap stuff really fast again. And so what Trump is trying to do is saying, look, we may have to put it up with a little unsettledness for a few months, but the goal is to raise the tariffs, make the other countries have to pay more. We can begin manufacturing stuff on our own soil again, and then we can reduce the income tax and ultimately get rid of it. And so that's what John F. Kennedy said. September 18th, 1963, Kennedy said, a tax cut means higher family income, higher business profits, a balanced federal budget. Every taxpayer and his family will have more money left over after taxes for a new car, a new home, new convenience, education, investment. Every businessman can keep a higher percentage of his profits in his cash register, put it to work expanding or improving his business. And as the national income grows, the federal government will ultimately end up with more revenue. So it's like if you cut taxes, people will have more money. What are they going to do with it? Spend it. And then the factories will have to hire more workers to meet the increased demand for the stuff. So the caveat is you give the tax break to businesses located on American soil, not just any business, the ones with their businesses located here. And Kennedy said, January 17th, 1963, lower rates of taxation will stimulate economic activity and so raise the levels of personal and corporate income so as to yield within a few years a increased flow of revenue to the federal government. So in recapping, you have the first century and a half of our country. It's tariff taxes on imports, and we became the wealthiest country on the planet, the highest standard of living. And then you began to have Woodrow Wilson come in with the income tax, and then FDR raise it even more. But that had the bad effect of causing outsourcing. And with outsourcing, the businesses that went overseas, their patriotism went with them. And now they're patriotic to their financial bottom line. And we call those people globalists. That's where the globalists came from. And these one world government people, right? And so Trump's fighting the globalists, he's fighting their agenda, and he's like, look, we need to make America strong again. We need to move the factories back here. We need to do what Jefferson said. Might have to sacrifice for a little bit, but have your eye on the goal. We're going to be able to produce stuff here, have more jobs here. And if there's more jobs and we hire more immigrants, then it solves a lot of different problems.
Wow, fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. I got to ask you, with even let's just say the income tax was something that was economically stimulating, which it's not, but let's just say it was. The principle of the federal government having a direct line of revenue to the American people's pockets, to me, just seems so out of character of the Constitution, our founding fathers' vision of a limited, uh, constitutionally restrained government. And of course, they amended the Constitution with the 16th Amendment to add income tax into that, which you articulated, and the history behind that with the emergency and the war and everything that made that what they thought a necessary action to take. But just reflecting principally when it comes to limited government, what are the positives of eliminating that direct line of revenue from the federal government to the taxpayer?
Right. Gives more individual freedom. It empowers the person and takes away power from the federal government. When you look at it, what's one of the largest items on the federal government's budget? It's welfare. Well, prior to Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson, all the welfare in the country was provided by churches. That's right. Churches from the beginning of our country. It was churches that formed hospitals. 8 of the 10 largest hospital corporations in America were founded by churches. Catholic, Baptist, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Seventh-day Adventist. And the churches founded medical clinics and orphanages and schools and soup kitchens. And the churches cared for the orphans and the widowed and the maimed soldiers and visited people in prisons and unwed mothers and shut-ins and juveniles. And like, it was all done by churches. You know, knew someone that worked for World Vision, and they were over in Mongolia, and they tell the story about how the government brought some kids in and dropped them off, and they said, well, what are you supposed to do with the kids? And they go, we don't know, we're arresting the mom for drugs, and so here they are. I mean, so basically World Vision is the welfare program in Mongolia. But this is the way missionaries did in all the countries. They go to Africa, what would they do? They'd start hospitals, they'd start schools, they teach the agriculture. They do all these things, but it wasn't until the Great Depression and Lyndon Johnson's New Deal, and then the big change was, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society welfare state. And Lyndon Johnson said, hey, let's have the government take over what the church had been doing. And so the government's going to give out food. Well, the problem is when the government gives anything, it's an exchange for political favors. And so you end up having them giving, so they want to get people on welfare. It's called the Cloward-Piven strategy. They were Columbia University professors, and they were socialists. And they said, you'll never institute socialism in America with tanks. You got to do it through the back door. You got to destabilize the economy and then have everybody come to the government, sign up for welfare. And then once they do, you got them hooked, and you can count on their vote because they're going to continue the free money. So I ask people, imagine if you were getting $1,000 check in the mail every week from someone you didn't know. $1,000. After a few years of that, would you ask yourself, who is sending me this $1,000 check every week? I'm going to find out who they are and vote them out of office. Would anybody do that? Well, I'd keep it coming a few more years. My kids got some bills. Once you get people to receive free money, you can count on their vote. And so it's a way to build a Democrat voter base. Get as many people out of work as possible. You can sign up inner city minorities and sign up immigrants for welfare, and you can count on their vote. But this is different than the country was at the founding. One of the things I talk about in my book is God gives commands to 5 groups: individuals, families, business, church, and government. The commands to the individuals include taking care of the poor. All right, Good Samaritan. I was sick. You visited me, and take the person to an inn and wash their wounds. The family commands are mostly relational. Husbands, love your wives. Children, obey your parents. Business commands are things like don't hold back wages and do an honest day's work. The church is commanded to take care of the poor. And they did. They'd immediately, Book of Acts, started feeding the orphans and the widows. And over the years, they started the hospitals and cared for the shut-ins and the elderly. And do you know there's no command for the government to take care of the poor?
That's right.
The command to the government's the shortest: protect the innocent, punish the guilty. There's no command for the government to be involved in education. There's no command for the government to be involved in healthcare. What's happened is the government has usurped the church's role. And again, the problem when the government does anything, it's like Egypt, where you need food, and the government says, we'll give you food, but it's in exchange for your cattle, your land, your lives. I love the quote from Gerald Ford, where he says, some people ask me, why don't you expand this federal program and spend more money? He says, I look at them in the eye and say, don't you realize that the government that's big enough to give you everything you want is big enough to take away everything you have?
That's right.
There's a quote from Coolidge, and he says, just because something needs to be done does not mean it's the federal government's job to do it.
Amen.
Right? We need to take care of the poor. We need to take care of the sick. We need to take care of the immigrants. We need to do all that, but it's not the government's job. Let the church be the church. Let it take care of it. Right? And so these are some common sense things that we can begin to look at.
Absolutely. And well, and who knows better how to take care of the needs of the local homeless people or local widows or orphans than the people who actually live in that community and know their names and know their needs rather than some bureaucratic, ghostly entity up in Washington, D.C., which is oftentimes very hard to identify. Mr. Federer, thank you so much for coming on here and sharing this history. People can make up their minds if they want to be pro-tariff or anti-tariff, but you need to know this history because hardly anybody is talking about it. And I think this is extraordinarily necessary to truly understanding why the president is doing this and how there's a long history of tariffs all the way back to, what was it, 1798? Was that when it was the second bill
89.
there? 1789, when Washington signed that Tariff Act. I mean, this goes all the way back to number one there with George Washington. So there's a long history of tariffs being used in the United States. And then even just 100 years ago or so, a little more than that, with tariffs on China, with the peanuts there. Unbelievable history. Sir, thank you so much. If folks want to check out more on this topic, they can get your book, The Interesting History
Yeah.
of Income Tax, which is great. You can see there on the screen. And then you also need to go to AmericanMinute.com, AmericanMinute.com. You see the website there. You can get his books, also sign up for his newsletter, which I think is extraordinary. It sends articles that are just like this, what we talked about today on various topics in American history. How else can people follow you and support what you're doing?
Well, you're kind. I do send out a email called American Minute, usually several times a week, and it looks at what's going on in the world and then some of the history behind it. But you can sign up for it for free. So it's AmericanMinute.com. We do have YouTube and Instagram and all those on my website. There's a little menu bar. You can click on media and watch, hundreds of my videos. But I just appreciate you having me on, and AmericanMinute.com.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, sir. It's been an honor to talk with you over the years with our connection at the Pillar Foundation, actually, where it started. It's a pleasure to continue that discussion and have you on my show. So I'm appreciative of it. Go over to AmericanMinute.com. Check out all the great resources there. And folks, share this with some friends. Everyone's talking about tariffs. Even at my church last week, the word tariff was mentioned from the pulpit. It's becoming a more and more popular subject, let's say. But again, as we started the program, everyone's talking about their opinions on whether they think it's going to work or not, but hardly anyone's talking about the history that we can go back and look at to observe whether this will be successful or not. So thank you all so much for watching. I'm your host, Andrew Muller. Continue to follow the show on X America News and just share it with some friends. We did really well our inaugural episode last week. Really appreciate you all tuning in. And until next time, keep it local, keep it God honoring, and